Today we're going to be talking about RAW versus JPEG. Let's go. We are now at Piazzale Michelangelo and there is a really nice view of all of Florence here, so let's take some photos. Okay, so we're at this place called Trattoria dall'Oste, which is kind of cool because Oste. But let's begin. Let's start with, what are JPEGs? So JPEGs are a file format wherein the camera applies its own coloring, its own editing, and it basically bakes in these settings so that you could have a nicer image because that's what the camera thinks is a nicer image. Or you could also set these as settings in your camera so that whenever you take a JPEG photo, it'll apply these settings. These settings can range from saturation to sharpness to contrast. So there's a host of different things you can choose to set inside your camera for JPEG photos. So to an extent, basically a JPEG is when your camera edits it for you. One of the pros of this is for people who don't really need to edit much or people who just take snapshots and just want to share it instantly, the photo straight out of the camera is already something nice, so you don't really need to meddle with it a lot. Also, the file sizes are a lot smaller compared to RAW files. But the one con of JPEGs that makes all the difference in terms of RAW versus JPEG is that you don't get as much latitude to play with the photo. Alright, we're going to talk about RAW next, but first, food. That was great, and now that we're done talking about JPEG, let's talk about RAW. Get it? RAW. Anyway, so RAW is a file format that varies between each camera system. For Nikon, it's NEF, for Canon, it's CR2, for Sony, it's ARW, so it varies. In these files, the camera doesn't apply any editing or any effects to the photo. So basically what you get is exactly what the sensor sees, just that information. One of the downsides of using the RAW file format is that straight out of the camera, the photos are really dull and bland. They don't really have a lot of vibrance or saturation. And also the file sizes are huge. They're like a lot bigger than compared to if you use JPEG. But one of the biggest plus sides and reasons to shoot RAW is that you have a lot of latitude when it comes to editing your photo, especially in terms of white balance and dynamic range, because the information is just exactly what the sensor sees. So the better your sensor is, the more information there is, and the more leeway and space you have for being creative with your edits. We had to walk in the rain, but we are at the train station now. We're catching a train going to Venice. I think it's over there. We are on the train now. We'll talk more about RAW versus JPEG when we get to Venice. And now we have arrived at Venice. Alright, we have arrived in Venice, and now let us look at our RAW files and our JPEG files in Lightroom, and I'll just show you some of the pros and cons of shooting RAW. Alright, so here we have the first photo that I took this morning. Alright, so the first thing we can look at when shooting RAW is here. This is the RAW file. When we decrease the highlights all the way down, you can see that the highlights here are still shown. Let's do the same thing for the JPEG. And you can see from the get-go that it's not really shown here, and it's not able to recover all that information in the highlights. Because remember, in dynamic range, it's usually highlights that the camera has a hard time reconciling and taking back the information. RAW versus JPEG. RAW is able to keep some of the highlights, while JPEG, it's just absolutely gone. Alright, so the second example we're going to look at is this one. This is a photo that shows a lot of shadows and a lot of highlights. So here you have the clouds to the highlights, and in the shadows are the trees and these people. Alright, first let's try to recover these highlights in the RAW one. Alright, and let's bring up the exposure a little and the shadows a bit, just to see that. You can see from the get-go there's a lot of space here that we can work with. Now let's take this and let's sync it to the JPEG version. Now we're going to look at this area in the leaves and see the difference. So here you can see that it's very unnatural. At the edges of the leaves where the shadows are supposed to be and it meets the highlights of the photo, it has some kind of white lines and it's really not that natural looking. Now let's look at the RAW file. It looks a lot better. Alright, so when you look at both, let's look here at the RAW one first, and then let's look at the JPEG. You can see that the RAW one looks a lot more natural than the JPEG one, and overall basically you have more space to play with the RAW one. So let's try to edit this in the style I would edit this. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to apply my preset, and then we're just going to adjust the white balance. Alright, so, and let's adjust the white balance, and let's raise the exposure a bit and lower the highlights. So this is the initial edit, and now let's sync this with the JPEG one and see the difference. Alright, so from the get-go you can see that the JPEG one doesn't really have a lot of space to play with white balance. So we can try to change this, but little changes make a lot of really weird effects in terms of the white balance, whereas in the RAW one, we have a wider range of white balance to play around with. This is the JPEG one. You look at your temperature here, and you can change it from a range of -100 to all the way to +100. Now let's look at the range you can play with in the RAW. So you can go from 2,000 to 50,000. So just by looking at that, there's just a lot more range to play with, and you can do a lot more things with the RAW file. Alright, let's look at the shadows. Here on the JPEG one, you can see that the teal is a little overpowering. It's a little too teal for my taste. But with the same edit, the teal is just right, I think, and it's not too overpowering, and it just adds a little bit of color to this photo. Alright, so that's about it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed this look into RAW versus JPEG. If you have any more questions, as usual, put them down below and I will try to answer them. Now that we're in Venice, tomorrow we're going to be exploring, and yeah, it's been a fun day. Florence was fun and I'm gonna miss it, but I'm excited for Venice. See you guys tomorrow.